So here in this class, we are switching from the Exodus all the way to Philippians, and really two more different scripture can scarcely be imagined. So it's quite a leap for us this evening. This is what the new books look like. If you don't have one, they're on a table in the back. Probably we won't go far enough that you'll really need one tonight. All right, unless there's something else that needs to be dealt with right now, let's begin with a prayer. Wayne, would you mind leading us? Thank you, Wayne. As is appropriate for a study of Philippians, I suppose we ought to begin this evening with Philippians 1, which is not coincidentally our first lesson. So let's start off by reading, let's say, the first 11 verses of Philippians 1. Is there anybody here who would like to read that? Philippians 1, 1 through 11. If you can pronounce Philippi, you should be good. Anybody? Philippians, Dan, thank you, brother. Thank you, Dan. All right then, now that we've gotten that context read through, let's go through and break it apart and see what we can draw from it. First question has to do with the first two verses of what we have read here. So, according to Philippians 1, 1 through 2, who are the authors of Philippians? To whom is this letter from? Paul and Timothy. And how do they describe themselves? They say that they are what? Yes. Depending on your translation, it might be servants. It might be bond servants. And what makes that such an interesting description? Why is it unusual that somebody like Paul would describe himself as a bondservant? Because what is Paul really in terms of church hierarchy? Yes, he is an apostle. And we know from 1 Corinthians 15 that he says, I'm not in any way inferior to the most eminent apostles. That this is somebody who has as high a position in the Lord's church as it is possible to hold. And yet, somebody who is basically just a step below the Lord himself, he describes himself as a servant. So what does that tell us then about position in the church? What does having a higher position make you? Yes. And the higher you get, the more you mature as a Christian, the more you advance in the faith. Do you outgrow that servitude stuff? I see a lot of head shaking. I like the head shaking. Instead, what happens? The more we mature, the more significant in the church we become. What happens to that servanthood bit? Yes, that the more we grow, it's not like being promoted up through the ranks in some earthly corporation where you get more and more important and you get to tell more and more people what to do. Instead, for us, it's the other way around, that the more you rise, the more of a servant you become, the more humble you become, the more you look to help others. And with of course, the ultimate goal of becoming like Jesus, who said of himself that the Son of Man has not come to serve, but to be served, and to give himself as a ransom for many. That really, all of us, there's a sense in which we're on an upward trajectory, but there's another sense in which we're on a downward trajectory, that we are striving to become more and more humble as servants. So, thus for the address, to whom are Paul and Timothy, these servants of Jesus, to whom are they writing? What's that? Yes, to the saints at Philippi, and do we see any subdivisions in that description? Yes, you have in the church at Philippi, you have saints, overseers, and deacons. What do we think of that? Why is this a...
I like this because it gives us an example in the New Testament of the church that was organized in the way God wants.
Yes.
The church had elders, they had deacons, and they had saints serving the Lord. This is how, what you find here is exactly how God wants a local church to be organized.
Exactly it. And what do we have here? Saints, overseers, deacons. That this is the pattern that we are following. And notice that you don't see anything more elaborate. We don't see that the church in Philippi, that they're part of the Thessalonican diocese or any of that other stuff. Instead, it's just a plain Jane local church. Finally, what blessing do Paul and Timothy convey? What do they say to the saints in Philippi with the overseers and deacons? Yes, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. This is a pretty common greeting. We see this at the beginning of many of Paul's letters. Why this one? Why start off most of the Pauline epistles by saying grace and peace? That is exactly it, Carl. Would you like to explain further? Yes, because even today, what is the traditional Jewish greeting? Shalom, which means what? Peace. So there is peace to the Jews, and 2,000 years ago, the way that if some Greek official were writing to another Greek official, the way that he would start that off is by saying charis, grace. And so when Paul is starting his letters by saying grace to you and peace, he is greeting a church that now contains both Jews and Gentiles. This is a greeting that transcends cultural boundaries. Anything else from this opening text that y'all want to talk about this evening? We've pretty well exhausted the possibilities there. All right, then, let's go on. Let's look at the next two verses. In Philippians 1 through 3, what does Paul reveal about his attitude toward the Philippians? What does he describe himself as doing there in verse 3? What do we think of that? Obviously, he is telling the truth here. And he says about these brethren, I thank my God in all remembrance of you. What do we think about him saying that about this church? How does that strike us? Jimmy? Yes, that first of all, it says important things about them. That these are people to whom Paul feels particularly warm. So it's a compliment in that direction. But does this also reveal something about Paul? What does it reveal about his attitude, probably not just toward the Christians in Philippi, but toward Christians generally? What does he regard them as? Yes, exactly. Because that's how you talk about a blessing, isn't it? That you are thinking about some blessing that God has given you in the past, and you say, God, I'm remembering this, and I'm thanking you for what you've done for me. And isn't that just a beautiful way for us to consider one another? Isn't it just so moving that here we have the apostle who presumably could regard himself as being above everybody, but instead he's considering all of these other Christians as gifts from God. And if Paul felt that way, then how should we feel about each other? Exactly the same way. And likewise, according to verse 4 here, how does he pray for them? He prays for them, A, always, and B, with joy. That these are people who are constantly appearing in his prayer life, and when they do, he is praying for them joyfully. And what does that say to us? What do we get from that?
Well, for me, I wonder, this is a challenge, this is kind of challenging, maybe more than we realize, because I wonder how much in our daily prayers and the things we pray for, do we pray for each other? Pray for brothers and sisters, not just God help me this problem, or pray for our physical family, but pray for our spiritual family. I wonder how much we do that.
That is a great point. Something that my mother used to like to talk about when she was still alive was the idea of a circle of care. Here are the people who concern me. And in our prayers, isn't it awfully easy for us to sort of default to a place where we have a circle of care of one person? Where our prayers, as sincere as they may be, they primarily concern us. And to the extent that we're praying for others, it's because they show up on the prayer list. And usually, when somebody shows up on the prayer list, why are they there? They're sick. Rufus? Yes. That is certainly the way that it ought to be. As somebody who's converted folks myself, I will testify that I do not pray for them as frequently as I should, but then again, I ain't Paul either. So, but yeah, that's an excellent point, that there is a special bond between him and this congregation because this is a congregation that he helped start. Harvey?
You know, this word joy is mentioned several times in this letter.
It is.
You just wonder how you define joy in this prison.
Yes. And that is one of the great paradoxes of the letter that I think we will uncover as we work our way through it. That on the one hand, in objective terms, Paul's situation is pretty rotten, both for him personally and for all of the problems that he's trying to deal with. And yet, Paul chooses to be joyful in his reflections about the brethren in Philippi. Did I see another hand up? Dan?
You know, my prayer is when I'm praying for the local saints because it's something wrong.
Yes.
Sounds like he's praying because he's happy. Thank you. I'm so happy to be friends with these people. They're so wonderful.
Yes.
Not difficult in my
Yes.
I guess that's the direction.
Yes. That I think one of the most valuable studies that we can do of the Pauline epistles is to look at the things that Paul prays for and then compare them to the things that we pray for. And look at the things that Paul thought were important in his prayers and compare them to the things that we think are important in our prayers. Because when things are going well, don't we have a tendency to kind of take that for granted? Okay, everybody around me, they're doing what they should. They're just steaming right along. And so I'm going to ignore them. And in order for somebody really to take a starring role in our prayer lives, then they have to be headed off the rails. And that's exactly the opposite of what we see Paul doing here. Paul says, I am remembering you in my prayers all the time, and I'm doing it with joy because you are basically on the right track. Although even there, as we know from the rest of the letter, are there things that Paul could have been picking on in the church of Philippi? If he had chosen, could he have been down on this church? Yes. Yes. And all the way through, there's this drumbeat of unity that probably doesn't exist if Paul is not concerned about unity in this congregation. So Paul could have chosen to have a negative, down on these people attitude. But instead, he is praying with joy. What should we learn from that? Look at the good side of life, and especially look at the good side of what? Yes, look at the good side of other Christians. Because, once again, if we wanted to, couldn't we find something negative to pick at in every Christian and in every congregation without fail? Yes, including this one, and I think that this is a strong congregation. There are still things that any one of us, we could just get to turning them around in our head and just complain and grumble, oh God, I wish they were so much better than they are. But when we do that, we are choosing to focus on the negative that is before us rather than what ought to be the many, many positives. Even when Paul was talking about groups like the church in Corinth, he found things to be thankful for.
He actually started that letter off positive.
Yes.
Before he started blasting.
Yes.
He did start off with positive.
Even though that was a church that probably none of us would willingly associate ourselves with. I mean, they're accepting folks who are in incest. And Paul still finds something, he's working so hard to find something thankful or something to be thankful about that even when in dealing with the church in Corinth, he is still thankful. And why is that attitude important? Why do we need to focus on finding joy in one another? Focus on finding reasons to be thankful in one another, rather than focusing on the negative. Cindy? Yes. That if we constantly are zeroing in on everybody else's faults and all the things that they do that make us unhappy, then pretty soon that's going to start showing up in the way that we interact with them and treat them, isn't it? That, as Jesus says, that there's all sorts of evil that proceeds out of the heart. And if our heart is negative, then our actions are sooner or later going to be negative as well. And conversely, if we have the opposite attitude, what if we are determined to find joy in the life of another Christian and to be thankful for another Christian? What is that going to do with the way that we interact with them? Yes. That. Yes. All of the spiritual flaws that really aren't that significant but can attract our attention anyway. And I think that's true too. And as a rule, which is a more effective way of changing people? Is it to zero in on their negative and have a low opinion of them and say, you're a stinker, you need to get better so you can be like me? Or instead, is it more effective to believe the best of them and encourage them to live up to it? Yes. That when we believe in somebody else, that's when they are more likely to rise. And that, too, comes from the perspective that we choose to have about them. It is very obvious that Paul is determined about these things and the way that he is regarding them. Anybody else? Anything else that we can learn from Paul's determination to thank God for them, to word his every prayer with joy? I don't see anybody else. Let's move on to the next question. How does chapter 1 and verse 5 explain Paul's rejoicing? What does he say is the reason that he is making every prayer for them with joy? Yes. Yes, it's that word koinonia is showing up here, variously translated as participation, fellowship. The ESV has partnership here. And what is this talking about? Does this mean that they're like going out and they're having neighborhood Bible studies? Is that the way that they are participating in the gospel?
Let me ask a question so somehow. The way I've taken this, and this could be wrong, is this talking about their financial support of the Apostle Paul?
That is exactly what this is. That Paul is being somewhat euphemistic here. Because when he is talking about their sharing in the gospel with him, what he's talking about is he is supported by this congregation. They are sending him money.
And this comes up again in this letter too.
Yes. That this is another one of those themes. Just like joy is a theme, so too is this theme of the Philippians participating in his work through the financial contributions that they're sending him. And
that's an important point for us, but I think so often we think of the word fellowship, giving money to preachers, not one way we think of it, and yet that's exactly how the Bible uses it a lot of times.
yes,
So we are in fellowship.
Yes.
The same way with the mean we support here in other places.
yes.
Same thing.
That, in fact, one of the most common uses of this Greek word koinonia throughout the New Testament is talking about financial sharing. It is talking about brethren who are participating in the work of a preacher by giving money to that preacher. And a little while ago, I described that as a euphemism, but is that really euphemistic? What spiritual reality is underlying this? What's the idea? How does this work in God terms? What does it mean that when all of you put a check in the plate on Sunday morning, that you are participating in the work that I do, that you are participating in the work that Sean does, that you are participating in the work that all of the other brethren we support all across the globe, you're participating in their work too? What does that mean? How does that work? Communication, explain.
You're in contact, you know what's going on.
Yeah, you certainly you should keep tabs on them, and it's obvious there's a lot of connection between Paul and the church in Philippi. He knows what they're up to. Let me, so there definitely is communication involved in this, but what else does this signify? What's that? Care? Explain. That obviously you have the Christians in Philippi who feel this bond, this connection with Paul. Andy?
When we give our money to the Lord, we're trying to further His kingdom. When the money goes to you or other preachers or whatever the need is, we're working toward God's goals. The goals, so we have fellowship in unity of purpose.
Definitely a unity of purpose, Doug.
It's also a sign of approval. It is our mark of approval, if you will, that we support you, support John, support
Yes. If you didn't think we were doing good work, then you should not support us.
Well, but it's also an opportunity for us to, not all of us can be preachers, but we can, through our giving, support the preachers.
Yes. And that, I think, is really at the heart of what this idea of fellowship in the gospel is about. Lee?
The way I look at it is we begin to work together as a congregation to financially support, carry on God's work. God's will is that I continue to be blessed myself, so I can continue to give to you.
Yes. Yeah, that 2 Corinthians right there is what you're talking about. That big discussion of giving about 2/3 of the way through 2 Corinthians. So what you say is true. This is obviously a complex idea, but I think that what's going on at the heart of it is it's almost like when we lay up treasure in heaven by giving to the Lord's work or giving to some preacher, that we're not just putting it in a bank vault somewhere, we're investing it. That it's almost like you are buying shares of stock in a corporation. You are, so to speak, you're buying shares of stock in a preacher. Because Sean and I have families. We have an obligation to support those families. And more than anything else we want to do, though, we want to study the Bible, we want to preach the gospel. That is what is in our hearts. We love that. And what all of you are doing is you are giving us the gift of time so that we can go out and do that, so that we can do exactly what we would do if we were free from any financial pressures altogether. So the support benefits us in that way, but it also benefits everybody else who is helping, because it's like when you buy a share in a stock and then you're not working for that company throughout the year, but because you've bought in, what happens is you get a dividend. And the same sort of thing happens in a spiritual sense, that because you have freed Sean from the obligation to have a secular job, when Sean goes out and studies with somebody trying to bring them to the Lord just like he was doing last night, then you get part of the credit for that because you've made it possible. When I have the time to sit down and write a blog post that goes viral all over the internet and helps people, then because you made it possible for me to do that, then in God's eyes you get part of the credit for doing it, that you have bought shares in the spiritual company that is me. And that, I think, is the idea of participation in the gospel, that you are participating by contributing money to the preacher so that then you can share in the good works that the preacher does. So,
And that same thing is true, not just with us locally, but the gospel
yes.
is spread in Africa, the gospel is spread in Dominica that we support, the gospel is spread in the Virginia area. All that preaching of the gospel, those souls are being won because of our financial investment that we get to share.
Yes.
We're sharing in that.
Yes. We can't all go to South Africa and preach the gospel with Les Maydell. But we can still share in his work when we send him our money.
And I have to say this, I'm really passionate about this because I grew up with preachers who did not work hard, and when I married Sean and saw how hard he does work, it does make me thankful that he gives me full time, because I would never see it if it wasn't for him being full time, pretty much that time.
Yes. That as devoted as Sean is to the gospel, what this really allows him to do is to have a family. So it is important to all the preachers whom this church supports, Sean and me both emphatically included, that we are humbled and thankful by the opportunity that we are given because of your participation in our preaching of the gospel. So what certainty does Paul express then in verse 6? What does he think is going to happen? Because you have these these Christians who have been diligently participating in the gospel? What does he say? What does he say he is sure is going to happen? I think ultimately that, but I think there's some stuff before that too. What specifically does he say that he is sure will occur? Has begun in them will complete. That it's not just that all of this is going to be profitable for the Philippians, justified by the Father. So, about the spiritual does associating those or a negative evangelists, this is all those slick with varying levels. They will not as that those are evil men who are taking advantage of and perverting and distorting the gospel for the sake of personal gain. So there's that negative connotation when it comes to money and religion. But when we look at Philippians 1, 5, and 6, do we see a negative connotation? Does Paul seem to regard the Philippians' support of him negatively? Yes. This is a good work that the Philippians are doing that benefits him. And why is it important for us to recognize that distinction? Why is it important for us to see that when Paul is talking about this connection between money and religion, that it's a positive thing? Why does that matter?
I think for me personally it matters because hopefully I motivate people to want to give and give abundantly, cheerfully, sacrificially, because their money is going for the best cause in the world, preaching the gospel.
And that's it. Because a lot of the time, isn't this a topic that we really want to sweep under the rug? We don't want to talk about giving. We don't want to preach sermons where the church is encouraged to give more. And I know that Sean has felt this too, because when I do, exactly, that it sounds self-interested. And so certainly, that danger can exist. I'm sure there are people who preach in buildings that say Church of Christ out front who are motivated by money. And that should not be. But when a preacher is not motivated by money, and just wants to preach the gospel, and the church is allowing him to do what he wants to do, then that is something that is good, and that is something that we should not be ashamed to talk about. Because it is something that benefits everybody spiritually. It benefits the people whom Sean and I are able to help. It benefits everybody here who gets to hear preaching and teaching from the Bible. And it benefits all those who are giving, because you're sharing in the work that we do. And so rather than brushing all this under the rug, this is something that we need to talk about as openly as Christians in the first century talked about it. Any thoughts or comments about that? All right, Harvey. Yes, and that is absolutely true, that we can't just do whatever we want with the Lord's money and say it's good because it's done with the Lord's money. That's preposterous. Instead, we have to make sure that what we are doing with our money is something that God considers good. And then when we do that, then it is appropriate to put that label of good work on it. Rufus.
We're fortunate here because we have brethren who understand this, that they're free with their money. I grew up as a PK, preacher's kid. Daddy wasn't paid much at all. And because brethren didn't believe in paying the preacher. Right. That was just not something we ordinarily did. But that's changed, and I'm glad.
Yes.
And man, I want to go with Dr. Clifford is saying. I think that's an excellent point because I hear from older preachers a lot that today preachers in the Church of Christ are getting paid more than ever. I think Christian mentality is changing for the good when it comes to supporting the gospel, and that's a blessing because I've heard that back in the day, Christians really went all into this. A lot of them went all into it like this. That's a good point.
Yes, and once again, it matters to me more than I can express that the congregation here deals with me generously instead of stingily. It reminds me of a joke that our mentor back in Beaumont, Max Dawson, likes to tell. You may have heard him tell it, I hope not. That one day an elder was praying, the group of elders were praying about their preacher, and they said, "Oh Lord, we'll make you a promise. If you keep him humble, we'll keep him poor." So that, I think, is a spirit that ultimately shows a lack of reverence for the gospel.
And I think preachers, talking to people like me and you, we never need to take advantage of that. The scripture says the laborer is worthy of his wages. If a man is being blessed to be supported by a local church generously, he needs to work hard.
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's a blessing. Never need to take advantage of that.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that there will be times in my work here that I don't meet expectations. There may already have been those times. But I don't ever want it to be because I didn't work hard. That whatever else I fall down in, I don't ever want that to be an effort. And I feel a deep responsibility to work as hard as any man in a secular job would. And I think that's part and parcel of this. That if you are investing in me as a preacher, then there ought to be some sort of return for your investment. Anybody else? All right, then, let's move on to question 4. In 1:7, what does Paul reveal about his feelings for the Philippians, and why does he feel this way? What position does he say the Philippians hold for him? Yes, that they are close to his heart, and why? They are partakers with him of grace. And what 2 things does he particularly cite here? Where are they partaking with him in his grace? Or in grace? Yes. They are sharers with him in his imprisonment. Where else? Yes, in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. And so once again, when we're talking about them as partakers of grace, what are we talking about? Because normally we see grace and we start thinking about salvation from sin. But does that appear to be the case here? Yes, this is once again financial. That the reason why Paul feels so close to these people is because they've been supporting him. That just like both Sean and I have expressed our gratitude right now, Paul is doing exactly the same thing. And once again, we have another place here where money is being talked about in a non-sleazy way. That this is not something that in Paul's case is promoting this sort of greasy dependence on the Philippians. He's not trying to curry favor with them. Instead, he genuinely loves them, and he is grateful toward them for what they have done for him. This is how things are supposed to work. This is the form that financial arrangements in the church are supposed to take. And it's not a matter of obligation. It's a matter of desire to help on the one hand and gratitude on the other. And so, because that, what does that lead him to do in verse 8? He's what? Yes, he is yearning for them with all the affection of Christ Jesus. Because even though there is obviously a financial connection between Paul and the church in Philippi, is that all that this is? What is it instead, do we think? How would we describe the relationship between the preacher on the one hand and the church on the other? They love each other. And in that loving relationship, it is that financial support that is just one of many expressions of love. So what does this show us then about Paul? What impression does this leave us of Paul the man? What words come to mind when we read these things? Yes. Gratitude is high on the list. That this is somebody who would never forget what the Philippians are doing for him, somebody who would never take it for granted. What else? Exactly. And that is a very interesting point that you raise, Lee. And I think it points out one of the problems with supporting a preacher who isn't there. Because when Sean and I are here locally, I think everybody here has a pretty good idea of what we're up to, especially the elders. They know very well what we are up to. But is that necessarily going to be true for a preacher who is 1,000 miles away? No. Yes, and there is a very real sense in which what we see in Philippians, this is a preacher report. This is him saying, okay, you have graciously given me this money that I appreciate so much. Here is what I am able to do because you are supporting me. That even though he's in a situation where you wouldn't expect much out of him, I mean, the guy's imprisoned. Even though he is imprisoned, he is still using his confinement as an opportunity to advance the gospel. So Paul is somebody we see from this who is A, very determined, and B, very conscientious. He wants to make sure that everybody knows what he is doing. He's being above board. What else do we see here? Yes? Yes. 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 Probably thereabouts. I think that is exactly so, that these are people who have seen Paul be through a lot, and they want to continue to support him through those hard times. So good point. All right, thank you for your comments, everybody. We will pick up with question 5 next Wednesday.